An analysis by a group of pro-Brexit economists has predicted that leaving the EU would boost GDP by 2 to 4% over the next 15 years. It's in contrast to the leaked Whitehall assessment, which looked at 3 different future possibilities, with the no-deal scenario resulting in an 8% decline in economic growth. Julian Jessop, chief economist at the Institute of Economic Affairs, is the co-author of today's report from the Economists for Free Trade group. He's in our Westminster studio. And Vicky Price is chief economic advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and is in the studio with me here. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Julian Jessop, can you explain first how you came to this conclusion?
Well, first of all, we've had to do a bit of detective work because, of course, the latest Treasury analysis hasn't been published. But we have worked out the model that they are using, and we've basically taken the same model but made 3 very important changes. First of all, we've modelled what the government policy actually is, namely a comprehensive free trade deal with the European Union covering both goods and services, and also a significant lowering of trade barriers with the rest of the world. Secondly, we've abandoned a lot of the very dodgy assumptions that the Treasury had made about future government policy in areas where it will have some control. That includes not raising tariff barriers unnecessarily with the rest of the EU, and a more sensible policy on migration too. And then finally, we've made more positive assumptions about some of the long-term trends, for example, in the costs of border checks, which we think will be substantially lower than the Treasury has been modelling. So the key point here is we're using the same model, but with more sensible and credible assumptions, we come up with positive numbers rather than negative.
2 to 4% higher over 15 years. I mean, aren't you cherry picking the things you like the most? You talk about you've put in the positive assumptions because that suits the result you'd like to see.
Well, arguably, of course, the Treasury is doing exactly the same on the other side of the argument. I think the important point about scenario analysis is to present a range of different possible outcomes, not to try and prejudge the negotiations about the future arrangement between the UK and the EU that haven't yet taken place. We've come up with what I think is quite a plausible set of assumptions, a plausible scenario. And as I say, it does deliver a positive result. I don't think we need to get too hung up on whether the number is +2 or +4. The key point is that there is a situation here where the UK could end up significantly better off.
OK. Vicky Price, what do you think of that, particularly the methodology side of it?
I can't say very much about it because, of course, we haven't seen the model in detail that the Whitehall departments have worked on. And, of course, I haven't seen in detail what this particular group has done. But I know very well what they've been thinking for a long time, which is that Brexit is good news. We're going to benefit, particularly if we reduce tariffs against the rest of the world. That, of course, is a very dangerous thing because it suggests that getting rid of most tariffs would eliminate our whole agricultural sector and our manufacturing sector too. And the interesting thing about it, of course, is that they have assumed a Canada plus. In other words, getting everything we want out of the EU, including on services. What we know full well is that any agreement on services is going to be very difficult. Any agreement on services with the rest of the world is practically impossible. And the disbenefits, if you like, for the economy as a whole are expected to be quite substantial.
So are you saying that the scenario that they are using is pie in the sky? It's not realistic?
It's fantastic if we can get an agreement which is as close as we are now. The chances are we're not. But of course, what we've got right this minute with the EU is a free trade agreement par excellence. So there isn't anything better around. If that continues, then yes, we'll do actually reasonably well. But anything that adds any friction to our trade with our greatest partners, which is the EU, is going to be negative for the economy.
Unless we can add more in the trade with the rest of the world.
Well, the rest of the world is quite insignificant to consider, except for the US, which is large, but very large to the extent that they can dictate their terms. We're talking about trade deals with Australia. They account for just 1% of our overall trade.
Julian Jessop?
Well, of course, the EU already accounts for less than 50% of our trade, and that proportion is going to shrink over time. We know that the fast-growing markets are in the rest of the world. Clearly, a trade deal with Australia on its own is not going to be a game changer, but the bigger prize is further ahead of trade deals with the likes of China, India, Brazil. And I'm confident we'd get a better deal far more quickly trading as the UK on our own, rather than relying on the EU to do those deals for us. Also, as far as lowering trade barriers are concerned, there's overwhelming evidence that erecting or having trade barriers is a very inefficient and unfair way to protect domestic industries. It's far better to put consumers first, to lower those trade barriers. If necessary, we have various mechanisms to protect those sectors that might be losing. The government has already proposed, for example, reforms to the way that we subsidise the agricultural industry. It's possible that some very low value-added manufacturing might move overseas as a result of lowering trade barriers. But is that really the future of the UK? Low-cost manufacturing that can be done far more better elsewhere?
Vicky Price?
Oh, yes, we're going to abandon manufacturing altogether if we take that to the extreme. But the truth is, of course, that all those countries I would like to deal with more in the future have the trade barriers themselves, and they subsidise their sectors very, very significantly. Look at China, how difficult it is to do business there. Look at the US becoming much more protectionist and about to impose tariffs on all sorts of goods here.
Julian Jessop, I just want to ask you, Vicky Price made the point that she hasn't seen the model that the Treasury initially used. This was the subject of what we learnt from the BuzzFeed leak, and nor have you. So how can you know that what you're putting forward is comparable? We could be comparing apples with pears in terms of what you've put into the modelling.
Well, we will be publishing our report today, but the key point is that we're actually using a publicly available model. We've done some detective work on what we think the Treasury has done. They're using a model that was developed in the United States from the 1990s onwards. It is a publicly available model, so other people, I'm sure, could replicate our results if they wanted to.
Julian Jessop, Vicky Price, thank you both.